Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And again, please visit us online at tertiumquids.org. Find out about the Tuesday morning group coalition meetings, meet policy makers. We are, as I say, not a think tank, but a do tank. Much of Virginia's most seminal legislation has started in the Virginia Institute. Our next guest this week, and I would be remiss, our podcasts are up on YouTube. Look up Freedom and Prosperity Radio, is Rick Larson, President and CEO of the Sutherland Institute. A great piece on the Mueller testimony, and I'm not even sure if that's not a stretch to call it that, but we welcome Rick to the program. Rick, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
Joe, I'm well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thanks.
Is there a stretch of the English language to call what Robert Mueller did testifying, or is it really just like the kid in high school who just said, just copied out of the textbook and made it his report? It seemed like much of it was, that's on page 48 of the report. That's page 48 of the report. It's certainly living up to what he promised, which was not to stray from what was in the report.
Yeah, I believe the credit we can give to Mr. Mueller is he kept to his word. I do think it's a bit of a stretch. That was a version of testimony. What it felt to me like was a series of rehearsed speeches thrown at a guy who was committed to reading from the script. and then what happened after was even more interesting.
Well, talk about the confirmation bias. Your article talks about the consequences of this, and it becomes more and more apparent that this is what congressional hearings are. It's just a chance for each member group to make their campaign speeches for the C-SPAN cameras and any other media that happens to be covering it at the time.
Exactly. Well, and Joe, we share this space. We know that think tanks have a certain responsibility. Mm-hmm. We're fully aware of the fact that news reports are a very quick and first draft of history. And we're even more aware that pundit reports are an editorial first draft of history.
Yes.
And it's incumbent upon think tanks to get somewhere between the long-term analysis and those quick hits that come across the media. But in very few cases will you see a better example than this. Because those are first drafts of history, I tend to bounce between news organizations to listen to the first responses to something this significant. Mm-hmm. If you switched between channels, you would think they were covering a completely different event. They were determined, they had their talking points, they were looking for the confirmation of their perspective, and that is all they reported on. There was very little objective dissection of what went on in that hearing.
And it happens from both directions, too, Rick. It will be excerpted to make the point, if you will, of anyone, almost like the way a trial attorney will try to push only the evidence that makes the case either for guilt or innocence of their client.
That's absolutely true, and I wish I could say in full-throated defense of my conservative co-partners and believers that we don't do that, but we do. And it really does. It's unfortunate when the news organizations begin to take the role of a prosecutor or a defender. That's not the actual intent of a free press.
Well, and I think it's to our detriment in a marketplace where we're trying to get customers, and it's an increasingly more populous marketplace. We see the numbers for the ratings of many of these news programs dwindling, and I almost wonder about the fanciful arguments that took place at BlackRock between Bill Paley and Edward R. Murrow about advertising in the news and how, if news has to be popular, then it's no longer the news. It almost seems to be one is leading to the other. It may just be correlation, not causation, but the harder they try, the seemingly less popular they are.
That's a great observation. I recall I actually started my career working in mainstream media, and I remember the conversations around conference room tables when news went from a primetime broadcast to 24-hour news channels. All of us, media in general, who understands the concept of ratings, we all whispered among ourselves, this is going to change things. When you have to hold an audience, when you're creating personalities, when you have to start building programming and filling the airwaves, beyond an hour newscast, what will that do to news? And I think we can all look at it now and see a lot of the pundits, or the so-called experts you see on the cable news channels. It's interesting to step back and see what their expertise really is. Some have served in administrations, have deep policy expertise, understand what they're talking about. Many don't, and offer nothing more than another opinion, but they offer it in a powerful medium.
Mm-hmm. It's a dangerous world, because I remember during the Obama administration, the idea was floated under the auspices of protecting journalists from prosecution, that they were going to start to issue licenses for journalists, so that the licensed journalists could certainly feel protected from having to be forced to give up sources, things like that. But then you immediately start to get into this idea of what is government licensure of the media going to wind up looking like, and would Fox News get a license from a Democratic administration, or would MSNBC get a license, or would they get struggled to find enough licenses for their news reporters that way? But it seems like also the other side can be true, where you see the citizen journalist catching something out of context, or picking up only part of the story and then reporting, not maybe even intentionally, a partial bit of how a piece of legislation is done, and inflaming a whole series of consequences, intended or not.
Well, again, excellent points. If you're an advocate of free markets, you should be an advocate of the free press, and you should believe in the fact that truth and expertise will rise to the top, and those that have less integrity will fall off. That's what a free market would demand. But now, messages have always evolved with the medium. Think about how different it is today from during the founding of this nation, when letters were circulated and the pace at which those things moved, and then it went to print newspapers, and then radio, and then TV, and now social media. Now you have the ability for anyone to weigh in immediately, light on facts or not, to weigh in immediately and draw conclusions that are shared across social media platforms. So I think it's incumbent upon we as citizens, I really think we've got to thread that needle and maintain our respect for the free press, but get better at consuming it.
Well, you mentioned in your column about the Mueller testimony about storytelling, and I know that the phrase might make somebody think about fiction, but a good journalist is the storyteller, so that however long they're given on a news broadcast to tell the story, that when the listener or the viewer turns away from it, they feel like they've gotten as much of the depth as they can, so that they can be informed about it. Are we teaching that well enough in what remains of our journalism schools?
I have serious concerns about that. I mean, if we look back at key points in history, and having just observed an anniversary, a lot of people like to point to Watergate. Mm-hmm. Watergate became what it is and was when the story was told, and that was remarkable storytelling. Take the politics out of it. Mm-hmm. Don't take a position on it. Think about the story that was uncovered and told, and it was told very well. Now we tweet, we abbreviate, we focus on inflammatory language. We don't fully develop the story, and it's troubling because Lincoln. I'll badly paraphrase the quote that Lincoln said: "What's taught in schools today is our government tomorrow." Mm-hmm. And so the more that we turn out a generation of journalists now being influenced by the current wave of journalists, add new media. And I do have concerns that we're not getting to the depth of the story before we blast it out there.
Well, you mentioned, and that is some seminal to my, adulthood and growing up through the Watergate period, and learning little bits when Mark Felt passed away, and we discover who Deep Throat was, and you wonder, was that the last moment of that kind of journalism, or the beginning of the descent to where we are now, where it's a leak from somebody, it's a whistleblower, it's WikiLeaks.
Well, yeah, I would have two responses. One, I had the privilege of being in an audience when Bob Woodward was asked the question, did you know what was happening before reporting it? And his answer was absolutely. But we would not report on something of this magnitude until we were sure. Now, that was a remarkable moment of of restraint from a journalist who respects his own craft. So it was interesting to hear that and think, now contrast that today with how quickly messages hit. And I fear the objective today with let's call them pedestrian journalists. I don't think they're deep in the art of journalism, and yet they have a following. Mm-hmm. And just like 24-hour news channels must hold an audience, and they create personalities and programs to do that, if you're going to gain a following and keep it on social media, you've got to constantly feed that audience with something sensational, feed it immediately, and I don't see where the time for the research and the fact-finding exists. Right.
Well, look at even the New York Times, an estimable news outlet, has a headline after the president's Rose Garden address earlier this week that is relatively straight to the point of what the president said regarding the mass shootings and white supremacy, and then changes it. And it's still murky as to what led them to change the headline, but it became much more incendiary and far more derisive towards the president's intentions rather than just taking him at what he said.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because sometimes small, seemingly insignificant moments, the news cycles are so fast, there's so much going on. That's a very big deal. We just witnessed the headline in a major newspaper changed by public opinion. Mm-hmm. That is not news reporting. I'm not sure what you want to call it, but it's not news. And again, we don't know everything. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's take our own advice. We don't know everything that caused that, but we know what happened. We know it said one thing, there was pushback from one perspective, and the headline changed. That's something worth looking into. I think people are hungry for reliable sources of truth. But I also think it's so tempting to follow our bias, just look for the things that confirm what we believe. There's a great quote by F.A. Hayek, again paraphrased, that says, he rarely read authors with whom he expected to agree because there was nothing to be learned.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned, and your article is all about the confirmation bias, and that we start consuming in our own echo chamber. We see it in the negative as well with President Trump, who is continually referred to as a racist, and then you see public opinion polls that say the public says, well, I think he's a racist. When here's somebody who's owned million-dollar businesses and has never once faced a civil rights violation suit in all of the people he's employed prior to being president, so it seems like the media is learning quickly that they have a great amount of power over popular opinion, and as we become more and more of a pure democracy, that is a very, very powerful tool.
Well, it's a serious risk, and it's most serious with the most inflammatory words. I mean, when you hear someone, the implication someone's a racist, you will now look for every indication that they are indeed a racist. Very few people will take the time and the energy, or if I can use the word, be brave enough to look for information that might say that person is not a racist. Because intellectual bravery says, I'm going to wade into the other side. I'm going to listen to someone I don't agree with, and I'm going to see if there's any validity to their points. I'm going to see what their stories are like. This is why I think it's so valuable, given the news environment that we're in. I think it's so valuable to move between channels and listen to the other side. Heaven forbid you might learn something.
No.
Heaven forbid you might weigh the two against the other and say, on balance, I see that point, I see this point. If I listen, my own conclusion is X. If we just race to agree with a bias we already have, that's not good thinking.
Well, it's also a dangerous place where, just beyond presidents and Congress people, we're able to tar and feather one another in the media. And if you almost it's the scientific, you can't prove a negative. It's guilty until proven innocent. We'll call you a racist, call all your sponsors and tell them you're a racist, and then let you try to prove that you're not. It's a scary place where we can start turning this, weaponizing it, if you will, against each other, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really frightening. And there's collusion all around. It's not just media, it's political parties, it's corporations. It's everyone who jumps on the bandwagon of self-interest and says, that's a compelling point, that works in my favor. I'm going to ride that bias into the ground because that's profitable or that'll get me reelected. So, yeah, we need to be, for all the things we can pound the table and expect more of our elected representatives, I think we are in a time where we need to expect more of ourselves. We have got to be more participatory, more objective, and more studied before reaching conclusions and making decisions.
Rick Larson is president and CEO of the Sutherland Institute. Great piece online at sutherlandinstitute.org regarding confirmation bias and the Mueller hearings specifically, but we've kind of gone beyond and started going deeper into the concept of it. In Virginia, in Charlottesville, of course, we've become almost an adjective to Charlottesville, to be Charlottesville. We've seen what happened. We're here at the anniversary of the riots of both sides, and I was there for them. And I was told some months later that in an unclassified briefing, intelligence experts told Virginia congresspeople that they found Russian bot farms behind Twitter feeds and websites that promoted attendance on both sides of the August 12th riots. And that discord was discord that the Soviet Union was fomenting in the anti-war movement of the 60s and continues to do. And it was a lot of it was based from the reporting I saw on the number of followers a Twitter feed had. And that would lend it gravity. So they would create a lot of fake Twitter accounts. They would all follow each other back and then say, look, I have 10,000 followers and I'm saying this. Therefore, you need to follow along with it. You mentioned in the last bit about we need to ask more of ourselves. Is that part and parcel of asking more of ourselves, not just blindly follow, this person's got 10,000 followers, he must know what he's talking about?
Yeah, good point. Absolutely, and I can imagine the experience you had being privy to that kind of information. If we take it all in, a very normal and expected reaction is to look around and say, I can't trust anybody. My country's falling apart. I don't know what to do, and wring your hands. Well, that's one response. The other is, in many ways, we're opening ourselves up to these threats. If the Russians have undue influence in social media, we gave it to them. We're the ones who buy hook, line, and sinker everything that we read on social media. And people who do that have created this risk. If we're not objective thinkers, anything will do. And the fact that foreign governments have figured that out and now see that as a platform to destabilize our way of life, that's not surprising. We should not be surprised by that. We should respond to that. It seems to me, now I'm not talking about pure espionage, but it seems to me this whole social media attack that's described and is being waged by foreign governments, the solution is disarmingly simple. Don't believe it. Don't buy into it. Look to your principles. Look to what you know is true. Look to what our founding virtues are of trust and faith and family and free markets. Is it consistent? You can easily dismiss a lot of misinformation just by going back to a checklist of your own principles of what you know to be true. Unless you're so biased that you like the inflammation and you like to pursue these divisive comments.
Well, we've seen it in the horrific shootings, whether it be the supporter and volunteer for Bernie Sanders shooting up a congressional softball game, or somebody who has finally had enough of the destabilization of the border to go to El Paso. And even as these things happen, we're learning little bits as it goes along. And as much as I like the idea, you said before, you want to catch somebody's first response to something because it's often closest to what they actually think before they get a chance to go back over it and try to remodel it. Legal proceedings and criminal investigations are often just the opposite. You have to let the real long quiet period in between the incident and the resolution. We learned that here again before August 12, 2017. We had a grisly series of murders that took place around college students, and we finally, in a very slow process, found found the murderer and were able to successfully solve several other murders along the way. But justice is very slow and very plodding, which I guess drives news medias to that. I wanted to ask you, though, with this idea of confirmation bias, wouldn't it be important for we the people then to sort of pick up the Woodward and Bernstein model of double, triple sourcing? So you see something, somebody sends you a story on Twitter, and you don't, necessarily know if that one story is true. So go find 2 or 3 other stories that tell of the same thing. But if you can only find one, maybe it's just it's a little thin for you to just believe whole hand. Is that a fair thing to try to do as individuals?
Oh, I think it's very fair, and that, again, that probably should include listening to a couple of sources you don't necessarily expect to agree with, to look for those counterpoints. I've noticed it's an interesting time to be working in a think tank environment, because I've noticed in my office I frequently hear the statement when there's an alarming headline or we're gathering to talk about an issue. The report of something one of us has learned is usually preceded by, if that's true, and then they'll go on to report on the story they just read. And I think that may be a necessary qualifier as we look at things. A lot of things we see on the news, if that's true, that's bad. If that's true, that's upsetting, if that's true.
Well, Rick, we've even seen news anchors on television lead into a story saying, if this is true, this is very damaging to the president. Like,
exactly.
What? You're sitting at the network news desk and you're asking that question. That question should have been asked long before it ever got to the teleprompter.
Before it hits the air. Walter Cronkite never said, if that's true. If he said it, he already had reason to believe it was true.
Yeah,
you're exactly right. It hits, and that's this speed issue. I don't know why information is considered so valuable if it's fast. We have this obsession with speed. I want to hear it now. Tell me what happened. Tell me the truth. Well, if you really want to know the truth, it's going to take a little longer.
Right, and the truth takes a little while to bake. You don't want to just eat the dough right out of the oven. Rick,
well said.
I deeply appreciate everything you do. I love tooling through your website. I had honestly never been there much, but the column you've written is beautiful and eloquent, and I think someplace where it doesn't seem it sometimes, but the majority of us really are. We just want to know what happened. When we get home from work, we're not necessarily here to get pushed in a direction one way or another. And I think there's a certain weariness in many of the people I know that they feel like every conversation is either a campaign speech or a debate that they're having with somebody, that there's going to be a winner and loser at the end. And I just appreciate your coverage of this from that concept.
Well, thank you. I hope we're raising the voice of most people. We're certainly not raising the voice of the extremes, and that's not our intent. But I believe a voice has to be raised for the majority of the people who really do want the truth, love this nation, believe in how fortunate we are to be citizens here.
Amen.
And we just got to return to those values of community and respect and holding each other accountable.
Well said, sir. You have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Again, you can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org, and our podcasts are always up on, if you're listening to this as a podcast, you already know what YouTube channel it is. If you haven't been there yet and you're listening to it on one of the stations that carries this program, look us up on YouTube at Freedom and Prosperity Radio. For all of us here, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.